This podcast is supported by Synthesia. Training videos shouldn't take weeks to make. Synthesia lets you turn text into professional, multilingual training videos in minutes. It's fast, scalable, and so simple anyone can use it. You can write an email, you can make a video.
Hey there, my name is Alex, and I'll be guiding you through this training session.
70% of Fortune 100 companies use Synthesia to modernize onboarding, simplify compliance, and scale global training. Podcast listeners get an exclusive 30-day free trial. Go to synthesia.io/greatminds. Don't miss it. This offer won't last. Great Minds on Learning is supported by Talent Desk, one centralized place to onboard, manage, and pay all your freelancers and vendors seamlessly and compliantly.
Oh no. With Talent Desk, you get seamless freelancer management, so you have time to make yourself that well-deserved cup of joe without losing your mind.
Visit talentdesk.io/greatminds and get 1 month free. Plus, more time for coffee.
Hello, I'm Kate Fitzgerald from the Learning Hack team, welcoming you to Great Minds on Learning. In this acclaimed series, Professor Donald Clark joins John Helmer to explore 2,500 years of learning theory, from the Greeks to the geeks. This episode is about organisational learning, how businesses, governments and institutions learn and adapt. From Herbert Simon's insights into decision-making to Argyris and Schön's concept of double-loop learning and Peter Senge's idea of the learning organisation, we explore how learning became central to strategy and survival. These were thinkers of action and adaptation who saw learning not as schooling but as a practical response to real-world problems. If your work touches leadership, change or learning at scale, their ideas remain as relevant and as provocative as ever.
Welcome to a new episode of Great Minds on Learning. This podcast has listeners from the separate but connected worlds of education and workplace learning, and we like to feel that the conversations we're having here are equally relevant to both of these fields. So as we've been focusing on education for several episodes in this season, it's good to swing the dial a bit towards organisational matters for a change. So that's what we're doing today. But don't worry, you education people, there's going to be plenty for you to learn from this one and plenty that's relevant to you and will be of interest, I'm sure. So our topic is organisational learning, but that's a pretty broad category. I've worked in that field for most of my working life, but I'm embarrassed to say I haven't heard of half these theorists. Senge, obviously, comes up a lot. But Donald, I'm all agog to find out how you're going to frame the topic. Can you give us an introduction to what we're going to be talking about today and who you've roped in for us to learn about?
Okay. Yeah, well, if you take the two words organizational and learning, that's really what most people in sort of HR and L&D world think they're working in. But actually, the truth of the matter is that, I fear that actually when you look at what they actually do in practice, it's a bit like amateur anthropology time. There's loads of stuff on values and courses on values, loads of DEI stuff, there's loads of talk of culture, but nobody seems to be grounded in any of the people who really thought deeply about the issue. I mean, this whole concept of an organization learning, going up a level of abstraction away from the individual, so that you're sort of using knowledge and learning as a means to grow and allow the organization to adapt, to change and make its way in the world. And I think there's a lot of sort of amateur time stuff in this area, whereas there are some quite good and interesting intellectual theories behind this where people thought maybe a wee bit more deeply about the topic. And so here, I'm going to go really back to quite an unusual starting point for this, and that's Herbert Simon, who talked about bounded reasoning, or was the limitations of what organizations can learn and do. We'll touch on that first. And of course, you have people like Taylor, who we have already covered in previous podcasts, who really laid the groundwork for this, the professionalization of training. You got to divide the work between managers and workers and be focused on process and training and learning. Then we've done some podcasts that have touched on the topic on informal learning, the Marzik Watkins and Gary stuff. who said that organizations are a bit like jelly. You know, people don't learn in a very formal way, as you might imagine. They learn by moving forward in the context of the organization. And then we have all those sort of, theorists that we did on leadership as well that touch upon this stuff. But by and large, these are quite deep. I think they're really interesting people who've all thought deeply about the subject and published, good books on the subject. Some better than others, I feel. But it's useful, I think, to start right at the beginning, I think, which was, and I think also, I'd really say it can be a very jelly-like topic, this, unless you illustrate it by example. So I'm hoping to just take the AI thing, which I'm more familiar with, as an example of how you might take their theory and apply it in practice, if that makes sense, John.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, this is very interesting to me because I found a lot of people I've talked to recently on my other podcast, The Learning Hack, are really doing more rather than L&D. They're really doing organizational development and organizational design. So it's going to be interesting background for me. So let's get going.
Okay.
Herbert A. Simon, 1916 to 2001, the Arthur C. Clarke year. Born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Simon was a towering interdisciplinary figure, an economist, psychologist, computer scientist, whose work reshaped thinking in decision theory, artificial intelligence, and organizational learning. A professor at Carnegie Mellon University, he introduced the concept of bounded rationality, challenging the idea of fully rational decision making. His model of satisficing, I think I got that right, described how humans and institutions make good enough choices under constraints. Simon won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1978 and also co-developed one of the first AI programs, the logic theory machine, in 1956. So why are we starting with him, Donald? Usually we get to an AI person towards the end of each episode as representing the future, but here we're starting with immediately.
Yeah, well, Simon is a really interesting figure, although better known as an AI figure. Actually, his deep interest was AI as a tool almost, because he was more interested in understanding how organizations adapted, processed information in order to move forward. So, I mean, that was his prime sort of mover in terms of his theory, and all the rest was tool building, really. So you mentioned the thing called the logic theorist in 1956. I mean, you're talking about the same year as the famous conference at Dartmouth. Some people regard that as the first AI program, really, and the idea, although it was quite esoteric, it was trying to prove theorems from Bertrand Russell's Principia Mathematica type thing. So, Newton and so on. But that was just using AI as a pure logical operating machine, as it were. And then he had another thing called the general problem solver, which is all about really, if you're sitting in an organization, you've got a problem, how do you solve that problem? What market should I move into? Blah, blah, blah. Okay. That was a more general purpose AI system around symbolic reasoning. Of course, the AI world has gone away into generative AI, away from symbolic reasoning. Now, that's by the by. But what was really interesting about Simon, I think, is the phrase you used there, John, which is what you call bounded rationality.
Yeah, what's that about?
It's unusual for an AI person because he basically sat back and said, well, we humans are a bit dumb. We make decisions with incredibly limited amount of information and resources. We suddenly make these major decisions in organizations or in our lives. What degree subject am I going to do? Oh, well, I like that, so let's do that. Your whole life's dependent on it. In other words, we often make very bad decisions based on very limited information and limited resources. Now, this influenced what he had a whole thing called around decision theory, which influenced his stuff on AI reasoning models. He thought AI would eventually be a huge boon to human beings. He was spot on this. Remember, his Nobel Prize was in economics, not in AI or computer science. And it was about decision-making in economic organizations. That's really what his interest was. Quite an interdisciplinary sort of guy in many ways. So problem solving, reasoning, decision-making within an organization. He thought humans were very, very limited on this, very bad at it in many ways, and thought that technology, in the end, sort of, if you combine cognitive science with the decision-making AI in organizations, you could sort of guess what his reaction to modern-day AI would have been. He would have seen modern generative AI as absolutely an extension of this bounded, limited rationality that human beings have. The extended mind, as people like Clark and so on define it. So AI would be a tool that expanded the boundaries of bounded rationality and overcome human decision-making to make decision-making more rational and actually more sensible. Data-driven analysis, for example, that was what his thing was heading towards. Problem-solving would have been a big thing. Making the organization more adaptable in real time as new data was available. So for him, learning is really organizational memory and data plus adaptation. It's not necessary, the human being run the show, as it were, but they've got to be open to the fact that they have bounded and limited rationality. I think this is very, very interesting in terms of how you might think about AI in the context of extending the mind in an organization or as part of organizational learning. Let's not get too bogged down on churning people through courses and carpet bombing them with courses. Let's think about organizational knowledge, how an organization learns, how it can be more adaptable. And AI is clearly the route forward on that one. So I wanted to start with him because I think he was the first person for me who thought very, very deeply about the nature of an organization and how it learns and adapts.
Right. So this word satisficing, have I
Yeah.
got that right? What's that? What does it mean?
To be honest, it's a good question. I think this is one aside to Simon, because he was a pure logician in a sense. Logical operators were his thing and logical reason. I found this secondary language that he brings in completely and utterly opaque. And I think there's a tendency for people in the technical world to go down that rabbit hole a little bit. And to be honest, I have absolutely no idea what that rabbit hole was in Simon. I was far more interested in his bigger. I mean, his theorizing on organizations is actually quite well written and quite clear. But as soon as he starts to come up with very specific solution, it's like the language of perceptrons and back propagation and so on. If you start using it analogously, something that's highly technical, it gets all over the place. So, to be honest, I have to plead the fifth on that one. No idea.
It looks like he's getting two different words and rhyming them together, and satisfying's in there.
Exactly.
I'm not quite sure what the other one is, but it's what you're saying. TLDR on this, basically that humans are not that great at making decisions.
That's right.
And they need to leave it to the machines.
That's right.
Is that
So
what you're saying?
yeah, so this is something I often talk about in talks. In fact, I've just given one in Barcelona where I started with the proposition, that the mind is an evolved organ and has an incredibly limited working memory, a fallible long-term memory. We sleep 8 hours a day. We're a sort of swamp of emotions that influence our reason all the time. That was one of the big critiques that Simon gave. So bounded rationality was the fact that rationality is massively polluted in the human mind with, in fact, there's some interesting papers just come out on AI on this about, can AI actually reason in the way humans reason? I think people have got this the wrong way around. Humans are terrible at reasoning, terrible at assessing risk, terrible at mathematics, terrible at basic arithmetic in their head. And therefore, I think AI shows us the way forward here. But he was one of the first people to recognize that we forget almost everything, we have very limited cognitive abilities. And it's very easy to see how technology doesn't just top us up, it massively expands cognition. That was what bounded, it's unbounded rationality as opposed to the bounded rationality of the human brain. Now, what you've got to do there, I think what he was on about was, with that more obscure vocabulary, was a bit like Karpathy's sense of vibe computing, vibe coding. In other words, you've got to get into the mood of dealing with AI. You've got to co-create with it, get it, in critical thinking, get it to critique what you do, collaborate, communicate with it. In other words, it's a different way of being and dealing with technology as opposed to I'm the subject, this is a tool, I'll just use this tool to hammer in the nail as a hammer. And I think he was one of the first to recognize that this is more than a technology, it's an extension of cognition.
Yeah. Is he kind of open to the charge fact? So we look at the kind of current state of AI. Obviously, he wouldn't have known that generative AI was going to go the way it has, although obviously he's very far-sighted and in some ways prophetic. What we get now at the current moment, what we get now from AI is something which seems miraculous, but really it produces good enough results as well. I mean, AI transcription, kind of voice to text captions, it's still only around 80% and hasn't really got that much better in the last 5 years.
Well,
Is it possible that, AI solutions, because they're based on human thinking, end up being good enough as well? And, obviously better in a lot of ways. It can do things that we can't do, can spot patterns we can't in massive amounts of data. But is it a kind of false assumption to think it's going to end up with a perfection of rationality that we don't have?
Oh, yeah. Well, I don't think so. It depends what you mean by perfection of rationality, because if you say that's pure,
100%,
well,
you
it
can
can,
give it a
it
question.
does in mathematics, for example. It depends
Yeah,
what you mean by. I mean, the word reason's a very odd word, and that's why there are interesting papers coming out that are using the word thinking, for example, one published by Apple this week, in fact.
yeah,
What is thinking as opposed to pure reason? Because they're separate thing. Pure logical
okay,
reason is just using logical operators, a very separate thing, coped with mathematical and philosophical logic. And machines are just exemplary at that. Humans can't match them at all. But what we think about reason is actually a bit messier than that. Human reason, which is thinking dynamically in a real context, dealing with the world as we move through it.
right,
But going back to Simon, though, I think he was one of the very early people to recognize that acquiring and codifying useful knowledge is a good thing. That what he called organizational memory, and then changing your experience, changing your strategy on the basis of what happens to you or experience or adaptation is a good thing as well. So learning is organizational memory plus adaptation. That's how he saw AI helping us in the future. And I think the idea is that AI, he would most likely say, well, AI serves us as a cognitive tool that supports better organizational decision making and learning, as opposed to the other way around. Actually, if we
right.
just turn everything into a learning organization, you hear that all the time, we're just going to do more training, more courses. That will help us adapt to the things going forward. He's saying, no, actually, it might be more complicated than that. We might have to supplement our own cognitive limitations in order to help us adapt intelligently to complexity, or sometimes even automate it. I mean, he
Yeah.
was open to that as well, which he did. That's what he was trying when he built those logic tools or the general problem solver. He thought that some of this would be better automated because it avoided all the frailties and fallibilities of human reason and thinking.
Good. So let's see where we get to from there. Chris Argyris, 1923 to 2013, and Donald Schön, 1930 to 1997. I'm going to have to apologise in advance for some pronunciations as we go forward. If I'm getting anything wrong, I'm sure people will let me know about it on LinkedIn. But we do our best. Chris Argyris was born in Newark, New Jersey, to Greek immigrant parents and taught at Harvard Business School. Donald Schön, born in Boston, Massachusetts, studied philosophy at Yale and also taught at MIT. Together, they pioneered the theory of double loop learning, a model where organizations not only correct errors, but examine and revise underlying assumptions. Schön's concept of the reflective practitioner became a cornerstone in professional education. Argyris once trained as a violinist before switching to psychology, and Schön played jazz piano professionally. Nice. So, Donald, tell us about the sweet organizational learning music they made together. Take it from the top.
Okay. Well, So I was around then in the late 90s when this book was published, and it caused a big stir. You know, you couldn't go to a conference without hearing the single double loop learning. Double loop
Yeah.
learning was the big thing, but it was a bit mosquito-like. It sort of died quite a quick death, to be honest. But I think there was really something in it. It was quite impressive. They really the phrase organizational learning was the head. I think that's the title of the book, actually, organizational learning, in the late 90s. Double loop learning. What's double loop learning as opposed to single loop learning? Well, single loop learning is what most organizations do. Something happens, a problem arises. There's we're producing too many panels with mistakes, or the quality's low. Let's correct that without questioning or altering anything fundamental in the business. Let's just go around a quality loop in the hope that it will improve. That's a single loop learning process. Okay, we'll run a course on it, put everybody in the course, they know how to do it, move on. Double loop learning, in terms of organizational learning, is something completely different. Here you're questioning the very assumption of the problem here, the fundamental assumption and values that lead to these mistakes being made, or policies or whatever. And here they have some recommendations about sitting back and reflecting on this. So what happens in a double loop thing is you really actively make the effort to think more strategically. And the most important thing of all is you add a layer of analysis. Okay. So, and by this, they thought you had to look for this thing called a governing variable. Kind of language is a bit esoteric here, but in
Right.
double loop learning for them, you had to search out for this governing variable. So what's a governing variable? Well, it's something like a really core belief of the organization. It's like something like, the Parker, let's say you're a pen company. You go, well, actually, we make pens. Maybe we should redesign the pen to go to a new market. And then suddenly somebody comes along and goes, actually, you don't make pens. We make gifts. So suddenly you have the Parker Pen Company that absolutely makes a fortune by remarketing the pen as a gift, something special that you give to somebody else. That's a change in the core belief, values, and assumptions as a guide to action in an organization. So he thought this was all fundamentally about actions. This was really important, that they thought that don't muck around with too much theorizing in organizational learning, too many courses. Think about what action you're going to take, look for the governing variables and focus on them, and think about the consequences. So action, governing variables, consequences. I quite like this because I'm more of an action as opposed to a person in an organization. I've run organizations, been on many boards and so on. I like to see action coming out of the theorizing and not endless theorizing.
Yeah.
Now, so you can I said at the beginning, I put this to the test. So is AI a governing variable for these guys? And I don't think it is, actually, because it's not a value or an assumption. It's more of a tool. So a governing variable around AI, let's say geez, all competitors using AI, they're hammering us on prices. The customers are buying from them and not us. They've got it, we don't. Now, would you do there? Actually, don't focus on AI. You focus on something like, well, no, not AI. We've got to maximize productivity. Or we've got to, let's say, have more focus on customers by responding 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, within a minute. So we'll have a bot as opposed to a call center, In other words, the governing variable is the maximizing productivity or a more focus on customer reaction time. AI would be regarded by them more as a means or a technology, a means to that end. So I think it's quite clever, this double loop thing, because it forces you to think at a deeper level about what you're doing in an organization, as opposed to just, oh, we need a course in X, let's deliver the course and move on. Which, let's face it, is what most of L&D tends to be about. If you think about these governing variables and tackling them, then I think you probably have more effect in a learning organization. The problem with it, I think, is that it's almost too smart and too rational for its own good, quite difficult to implement, because there's cultures of loads of, they have loads of sort of defense mechanisms here, and I think one of the things that they went on a lot about was, to be fair, they tackled this. They thought that organizations were full of most managers were bad in the following way. They have great defensive routines. Whenever you try and change something, they're smart people who will come up with every reason under the sun for not changing. They called that defensive routines, in other words, especially, the graduate class, as it were, is trained to win arguments, not do things, and they're very good at defending what they already do. So it's actually quite difficult because they're very entrenched, funnily enough, more entrenched and resistant than many people. And
Yeah.
that's why cultures become entrenched and resistant to things like AI and so on. So interesting people, I think, because their deep dive, I think, certainly I remember at the time it made me really think more deeply about how we might change things. And when I was running an organization at that time, and I think that was true for many people.
Yeah. I think one of the things that's very satisfying, I think, I found when I first heard about it, back at the noughties, whatever, was that it's one of those theories that sort of accords with your own experience of life. And you think, yes, of course, that's the way things work. We start out with a plan. We have a discovery phase. And the discovery phase tells us that not only will the plan not work, but that our initial assumptions are all to cop, and actually we're looking at something else entirely. I think where it does get really difficult in organizations is that organizations have a big plan and then it's pushed down to people to implement. And it comes with this set of absolute organizational imperatives. And that discovery phase often shows up stuff that contradicts the initial premises.
Yeah.
And because you're punching up, it's rather hard. In a way, I'm putting the opposite case to you, Donald, that, it's the people on the ground are often trying to tell top team, no,
Right.
this is kind of misguided because what we actually find when we try to implement is this, you can't do this because this, that, and the other, actual circumstances and so on.
I think that's a good observation, John. Having just freshly, it's interesting. I gave a talk just last week, and I started with that idea, and there are some really fundamental things that happen with AI in an organization that come as a shock to managers who are overly defensive. One, that it's bottom up. In other words, you suddenly discover that everybody's using the damn thing, but nobody's telling you they're using it. So that was the first thing. The second thing was a sort of switchback thing that actually you have to realize that it's coming after white collar, not blue collar work. In other words, it's after your job. That comes as a big shock to people when they suddenly go, "My goodness, look at this thing writes reports in a minute. It's after my job." And then another revelation, as it were, that comes through this deeper thinking. So that was a switchback from blue collar to white collar, bottom up, not top down, because almost every technology in the history of technology, steam, electricity, the internet, was all top down. This is bottom up. And then a third one is really interesting to me, which is the deeper realization that actually we've lived through 20 years of technological escapism, from gaming, gambling, social media, hailing Ubers and all that jazz, through to porn. All that money, all that effort put into technological escapism. Suddenly you get this technology that says, no, this is a problem solver, defined in Herbert Simon's terms. This is an amazing technology that's incredibly smart. People find that very difficult because they've almost trivialized technology, infantilized it. Suddenly it's as good as you at something. They find that very difficult to take. And so I think, yeah, that deeper reflection that you mentioned there is stimulated by this idea of a double loop thinking, which is quite a nice way of just a nice heuristic.
This podcast is supported by World of Learning Conference and Exhibition. L&D professionals, you need to be at World of Learning, the leading L&D event happening this 7th and 8th of October at the NEC Birmingham, UK. An unrivaled opportunity to learn, discover, interact and network. Register for free today at learnevents.com. Great Minds on Learning is sponsored by the Learning Technologies Awards 2025.
When they announced the gold winner, we were, it's us. Wow. It was really a very, very special moment.
It meant so much to win this award. It was a really proud moment for all of us.
The Learning Technologies Awards brings together the best in global learning technologies. It's a highly prestigious recognition of achievement and innovation.
Quality is very, very important, and learning technologies have got such an amazing reputation for quality.
They're really rigorous. They're not sort of just handed out. You really have to demonstrate that this course has made an impact.
Winning can change lives, build careers, and turbo boost learning in your organisation.
Winning the award has brought a lot of recognition to our team, and it's really validated a lot of things that we're doing for the group.
It is such lovely validation.
Basically, this confirmation that we're on the right track, that it makes impact, and that we're able to expand.
Apply today at learningtechnologiesawards.co.uk. Peter Senge, 1947, still alive, born in Stanford, California. Senge studied engineering at Stanford and earned a PhD in management from MIT. His influential book, The Fifth Discipline, 1990, popularized the idea of the learning organization, a very well-known phrase, identifying systems thinking as key to organizational adaptability. Senge argued that genuine learning integrates personal mastery, shared vision, mental models, team learning, and systems thinking. His early work in environmental systems helped shape his holistic view. He once described modern management as an artifact of the industrial age. Donald, this is a very well-known and oft-quoted figure in workplace learning, and I believe that he's the reason why we talk about learning nowadays on the organizational side rather than training. People often blame him for that, or applaud him for that, depending on how they feel about it. But what part did his thought play in the development of organizational learning?
I think that's right. It was a sort of big best-selling book at the time. I have my copy here. I just got it off the shelves this morning. It's quite yellowed, quite old. But out of these theories, this is my least favourite to me. I think this is a terrible book, by the way. I think it was just so vague and all over the place, really. But let's first of all just examine. I might be wrong. He might be right on this. But he had this 5. He certainly made the phrase learning organization popular. But I'm not too sure that was such a wise thing if you followed his advice. He has these 5 disciplines. What is the 5th discipline? Well, the first one, the most important one for him, was this thing called systems thinking, which is okay. This integrates all the 5 together, okay? It fuses the other 4 together, if you want to call that, gets them into one entity, pulls them together. So what are the other 4? The idea was that, you don't be too siloed about this. The 5th discipline is one thing, systems thinking. First thing is personal mastery. You've got to really take learning seriously as an individual, to clarify and deepen your own knowledge about what your role is in an organization, what even the personal vision is you have in terms of that organization. And I think this is where it gets a bit sort of odd, really, because everything gets thrown back onto the individual in many ways to do this. He called that personal mastery, which is just learning, really. The second one is mental models, or mindset might be a better word. Now, it's what deeply ingrained assumptions do you have as an individual? Generalizations you just assume are true, how people understand the world, do things in the world, and so on. He said you might have to think about that as well. So personal mastery, learn about the world, be open to changing your mental models. And then the third one was this notion of sharing your vision, developing a shared picture of the future. And this is I think this is the most vague one of all, to be honest. I think people get carried away with collaborative learning and sitting around those little tables and rooms with flip charts on the back of Senge, and it never quite worked. It was a huge waste of time trying to get this shared vision all the time, where it was just shared banality a lot of the time. And then the other one was team learning, the idea that actually the capacities of a team to create results is the result of their desire to do things. And again, I think this is true, but much more complicated. And I don't think the 5th discipline really gave enough advice on team learning. People like Salas, for example, a real expert on what you do, how you build teams, or Belbin and so on. Those people were far more interesting in all this. But if you bring team learning, sharing things, mental models, mindset, personal learning, that all comes together in what he calls the 5th discipline. This notion that you are have to think systematically about learning and learning organizations. And that was Peter Senge's thing. But this damn book is like 450 pages long, and you find yourself wading through. It's massively overwritten, and therefore I'm not entirely sure that it's spot on. However, it was interesting. I was thinking about you doing this podcast. So, well, using the AI theme, let's put it to the test in AI. And funnily enough, I had a little bit. Oh, well, maybe he was onto something here, because if we think about AI in terms of systems thinking and look at these four things, suppose I was trying to put AI into an organization. There was a very interesting email, John. I don't know. It got us a lot of purchase and friction on the internet from the chief executive of Fiverr. I don't know if you know Fiverr, Fiverr. It's a huge global freelancers market.
Yeah, as a
So
freelancer, yeah, of
so
course.
freelancers know it's a massive thing.
Yeah.
And the chief exec put out a memo or an email, I can't remember which, told the people, said, listen, AI is coming for your job. It's going to automate all this stuff that we're doing. In fact, it's coming for my job as the CEO as well. So, and he called it the wake-up call, It's coming for us, guys. We better do something about this. And funnily enough, it sort of matched the Senge thing a little bit, because he said, first of all, quite a nice little email, I think, to all staff saying, listen, we're all in the same boat here. What we're going to do about this AI stuff? And the first thing he said was, listen, let's learn about it. And it was the personal mastery thing. He's saying the first thing he said was, listen, study, research, master it, get to know what it is. And then it was almost as if it was the mindset, mental model thing he was trying to switch as well. He said, become a prompt engineer. That's actually part of your job now. If you don't know how to do that, then you're going to lose out. So he was picking up on things that were very reminiscent of Peter Senge's work. Personal mastery, changing your mindset model about what your role is and how you learn and how you problem solve. And then also, interestingly, the guy, the chief exec of Fiverr himself, he then says, actually, the most important thing is look for the most knowledgeable person in your team and move forward as a team, which is also one of the Senge principles. And then he ended his email by saying, get involved in making this whole organization as an AI first organization now. We have to get efficient using these tools and technologies. So he saw it a bit like, he didn't really see it as the strategic thing in itself, AI. It was about building a shared vision. So strangely enough, when I thought, well, because I really admired that piece of communication from a very forward-thinking CEO, but actually it was almost an exact copy of what Senge had put forward as systems thinking in the fifth discipline, and he had them as stab points in his email.
Yeah.
So maybe, I thought maybe Senge was onto something here in terms of change management, thinking big and deeply about this.
Okay. To backtrack a bit and seize on that word mastery, and in some competency frameworks, I've seen mastery as a level. So it's like, it is that Senge's definition of it? It's kind of like, you're a novice, and then you're an intermediate, and then you achieve mastery, and then after that, everybody has to kind of bow down and accept whatever you say. I mean, it is that's the kind of feeling when it becomes a level, but is that in Senge as well, or is it a more kind of active?
Now that is a very good question, because Senge's full of a bit woohooish on this, personal mastery, because quotes from the North American native cultures. It's all very all over the place, I think, to be honest. He doesn't really know anything about how technology plays a role in this either. But I think it's an interesting question, because I actually think the competence-based learning model should be applied in higher education as well. I think that's what goes wrong there very often. There's not enough focus on actually learning the real stuff. It's all a bit loose, and therefore, people wander all over the place when they're learning. Nevertheless, I think, the focus on learning or mastery as a word is a bit of a mistake. I think what he did was popularize the term learning organization. I don't like that phrase. I don't think organizations are learning organizations, because I don't think employees see themselves as learners. They see themselves as fathers, mothers, friends of people, brothers, sisters, whatever. They see themselves as employees, workers. They don't see themselves as learners, and I think it's almost a conceit of L&D that one should one should make them think that way, because it's not the way people operate in organizations, which is why informal learning is about 80 to 90% of the goal and not courses, and why these courses rub people up the wrong way. They just seem so inappropriate. They're the thing you just mentioned, they're the dominant do this, do that type things. Here are 5 things that you need to know, and if you do them perfectly, the world will be put to rights. And this is not actually people's real experience in the world. So, and this is a problem with Senge's vision as well. It's not clear that a single vision is even possible in organizations. There was a paper by critiquing Senge by a guy called Garavan, who said this single vision thing, it doesn't really work. Organizations are complex and messy. That's why the double loop thing's a wee bit more satisfying, because it copes with it's looser and copes with a wider range of cases. So I'm saying you will be a learning organization, because that's almost like one dominant perspective of an organization that almost nobody really holds. Most senior managers and boards never use the phrase learning organization, and most employees would never use, say, well, who do you work for? Well, I work for X, Y, and Z. They're a learning organization, don't you know? Nobody would use that sort of language. It seems oblique and abstract and a bit misjudged.
I wonder if X is a learning organization. Sorry, irrelevant.
Organizations are learning organizations, even universities, strangely enough, but even in the educational world, but because they're slow learners, they don't actually, they don't change process at all, or they don't adapt to the world very readily, very slowly. But it presumes that also an organizational culture is always open and has these collaborative and reflective in a way that most organizations are not. The guy who collected my rubbish this morning on a Monday morning is not part of an open, reflective learning organization. He has a job. And I think this is what many of these theorists miss out, that, it could be too abstract for their own good, these building of these models and some of the esoteric language that we've all already discussed.
Yeah. One thing that's interesting about Senge to me is that the things that you've just been talking about raise questions that are very much live debates in L&D, and that I hear all the time in kind of forums. Especially one way it comes up nowadays is with the increasing ability of technology to personalize learning. And, we've kind of seen that with LXPs and so on, and now with AI. It kind of raises the question of, is everything focused on the performance of the individual, or should we be looking more at team dynamics? And that's a kind of back and forth that we hear people talk about all the time. So Senge is interesting in that he raises things that are very much, au courant and in the air in L&D at the moment. And actually, I'd like to pick up on some of those when we come to summing up. But should we move on?
Yeah. No, let's do that. Yeah, the team thing is interesting because, it's debate without evidence, I find. I just don't go along any of those sessions now in L&D because they're so vague. Nobody quotes any evidence. It's just like chatting in the pub. And it's an endless debate. Say it's like Groundhog Day. Like I've had 40 years of it, and nothing seems to change. So, but let's leave that till the end. Good idea.
Ikujiro Nonaka, 1935 to 2025, and Hirotaka Takeuchi, 1946, and still alive. Nonaka, born in Tokyo, was a professor of Hitotsubashi University. Takeuchi, born in Tokyo as well, taught at Harvard and Hitotsubashi. Together, they introduced the SECI or SCCI model. That's an acronym: socialization, externalization, combination, and internalization. And this model was to explain how tacit and explicit knowledge interact in successful organizations. Their 1995 book, The Knowledge Creating Company, helped shift management theory towards knowledge as a strategic asset. The pair drew inspiration from Japanese firms like Toyota and Honda, and Takeuchi previously co-wrote the famous paper that inspired the Scrum method in agile software development. Donald, I've heard a lot about tacit and explicit knowledge in the past, usually in the context of knowledge management. And I've worked on projects using agile as a project management methodology, and I've been a Scrum master and all the rest of it, but never put the two together. Is there a conceptual link between these two pieces of work, or are they just both very good but separate pieces of work?
I mean, this is a really interesting, like, big sort of shift in thinking about organizational learning, because you had people like Senge and so on, fifth discipline, blah, blah, blah. Very sort of personal mastery, very individualistic, very American. The book is clearly written by an American when you read it.
Yeah.
Along comes these two Japanese guys, because by this time Detroit was a wreck. Detroit, the car industry was being hammered by Toyota and Honda and others.
Yeah.
And the quality of these cars was outstanding. And because these two, one who was based in Japan, the other at Harvard, they focus on product development, knowledge creation, competitive strategy, like hardcore stuff. This was a model of knowledge creation within an organization, how you improve what you do to the nth degree. So the knowledge creating company was based on real evidence. It was the evidence of Toyota, Honda, and what was the name of it? Canon, the big photography company. Those cameras suddenly hammered the market as well.
Yeah,
So
we're using one now. I'm using one now.
use one right there. Yeah. So,
And the software is crap, Canon. Do something.
Well, this is true. I've given up my SLR Canon now for my iPhone. Interestingly, it's proved to be a better camera in the end. But the knowledge creating company was based on the success of those companies. It was all about gaining this competitive advantage by continuously creating new knowledge. That's the key thing. A continuous creation of improved. And I did this. I don't know if you remember when I was running Epic and we worked together. I got ISO 2000, and continuous improvement was a big thing process. I loved that stuff. This was far more influential on me than the fifth discipline, for example. Now, in terms of organizational learning, based on the success of these Japanese firms, they had a model. All academics have a model, the SECI model, SECI model. Now, this is where your tacit and explicit thing comes into place. So to summarize it really quickly, so the SECI model is socialization. That's tacit. So I've got this stuff. I can't really express it. I've got it deeply embedded in my brain. Tacit to tacit, socialization, just spreading the word. Externalization, you got to get tacit, you got to make that explicit, you got to surface the tacit knowledge. Okay, I may know how to paint using watercolors. I know how to do that, but try explaining that to somebody else. You got to make that knowledge explicit. We'll put a little pool of water in, dab the brush, and so on. Then you've got to make that explicit to explicit stuff by combining it and then internalize it, get it back to tacit. So it's a big loop. Tacit knowledge has to be surfaced, make it explicit. And then that new explicit stuff has to be shared and turned back into tacit knowledge here. So the fundamental layer for these guys is good, solid competence, skills, and knowledge that makes brilliant cars, as opposed to just surface learning where you just give somebody a task and they slam that bit of glass into that slot. They thought that was the key to improving workers' experience, their personal experience, but also the quality of the output. Now, that probably didn't make a lot of sense to people. What is the SECI thing? The socialization was the sharing of this tacit knowledge, like that person's good at watercolors, that person's good at oil painting, that person's good at sculpture, okay? Let's get that tacit knowledge, share those experiences and interactions. And this is Japanese culture. It's communal. It's one of sharing. And that's what these organizations were brilliant at. There was a superb level of psychological safety, we'd call it now. I would say what you think. What's going wrong here? Tell us. Track it statistically. So you surface the tacit knowledge in people. You externalize it then. So you say what this tacit knowledge is, but you turn it into explicit concepts, actual process, actual numbers, actual things. Often, and you do it through dialogue and reflection. And this is a big thing in Japanese culture, to quietly reflect and discuss things to come to a conclusion.
Yeah.
Then SECI S, so that was externalization. The combination one is you apply that explicit knowledge, in different parts of the organization, you spread it across the whole organization. You have a standard like ISO 2000, it was then, it's different now. And you say, well, this will apply to everything we do. We will have this principle of getting things right first time. So if I write a document, it will have no spelling errors because it's my responsibility to solve that problem before I pass it on to you. So you're building things that people know tacitly, you externalize them, and you apply it as a rule. You apply it as explicit knowledge. And you put it back into the organization and make sure it eventually becomes tacit knowledge. So people don't think about it. They automatically put their documents through a spell check before they hand it on. It becomes tacit, automatic. So, and this is what the Japanese triumphed in and still triumph in, to be honest. This is what the Chinese are triumphant at in manufacturing, certainly. That spiral of, I think they used to call it spiral of knowledge creation or something, spiral of something. But I think it was right, continuous improvement. That's what a learning organization is. That's not still, I think we didn't take that seriously enough. We still have go on a course, do the course. It takes about 6 months to build it. By that time it's out of date. Come back, give everybody the course, they forget it all. There's no real dynamic, agile movement through an organization with that approach to the world,
Yeah. And yeah, I'm seeing all sorts of links with things from my own experience in L&D and from hearing other people's experience. And a link with double loop learning in a way, because, the explicit knowledge goes into formulating what we're going to do now in this project. And then the tacit knowledge comes out of actual contact with reality, feedback, discovery. You find that there is a lot of tacit knowledge that contradicts perhaps what was in the explicit rule book. And I think it also highlights for me, a danger, perhaps I'm extrapolating too far here, a kind of danger that it lurks in all organizations, that the human beings are capable of thinking one thing and believing another, that they can hold two completely contradictory mindsets at once, which is, you often find this in governments, departments and so on as well, that, well, I know this is what I know in my gut, but actually this is what I know that the organization wants me to know and the organization wants me to think. And people are capable of running two completely different thought systems, an explicit and tacit one at the same time, and not letting them interpenetrate at all.
I think that's so true. I mean, there's a very famous book in this in philosophy, if I get it right, Thomas Nagel, called, I think it's called Equality and Partiality. It's got a title like this, and it was his view was that in morals, people, they're champagne socialists in the pub, but they send their kid to a private school type thing.
Yes, exactly. Well, doublethink we call it, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah. They pay the plumber cash to avoid tax, but then they're big, but they, decry everybody else who doesn't pay tax and that sort of thing. People that have their private morals are very different from sometimes their public expression of morals. I think that's true also in some basic beliefs very often. I wholly agree with that. I mean, Nietzsche used to think it was we just constantly put on these masks all the time when we're dealing with other people that weren't really essences of your true self in any sense. But go back to the double loop learning thing. Yeah. I think you're right there. I mean, if you take that theory seriously enough, the one we've just described, the sort of Japanese theory, and apply it to AI, for example, you find that you could say, well, let's suppose I've got a car. We'll stick to the car company example. Actually, cars are not selling well, or they're all electric now, and I'm producing diesel and petrol cars. Why don't I make it a robot company? Which is what Tesla are going to do. Okay, in fact, they've done this in Japan. It's a very interesting example. This at the foot of Mount Fuji, they have this factory. And what they did was, you have a car factory. You go, no, let's switch it to making robots. But you do a double loop thing. You go, let's change the fundamental idea what this factory is. Let's make it a robot factory where robots make robots. That's a double loop thinking. That's deep. That changes the whole game. Now, if you bring this back to the tacit knowledge, like, what do we have to do here? We've got all these workers who know how to make cars, but suddenly actually you're doing something radically different. You're surfacing all the technical knowledge of all your experts and actually automating a lot of it through realizable processes in AI. In a robot, you're getting a robot to do the work. So then you apply this across the whole organization, which is what these guys would have done, because that's one of the principles here. You externalize the tacit to explicit. You redesign all your processes and procedures around robots making robots. And then everybody who works there has a completely different role. All they're doing is supervising robots now. They've internalized everything. Everybody who works there. And that's why this factory is now a dark factory. It has no lights because there are no human beings on the shop floor. All the human beings are sitting around the edge in lit offices controlling the machines, the robots making the robots. There are no lights because there are no humans. Now, that's an interesting sort of bringing together all this stuff, double loop, deep thinking, this tacit knowledge being changed, radically changed the organization. It learns very quickly that we've got to change from being a car factory to a robot factory. You know, that's the sort of deep thing. That's a learning organization to me.
There's a big word in modern startups nowadays for that, pivot. And you come across it. You come across it in branding all the time with names that a company, which is why so many names now are nonsense. The more nonsense the company name is, the better, because you'll start out with a name that's very descriptive of what you do. Maybe you want to kind of start off as a media organization, and you find that actually you get no viewers at all, but everybody loves your merch, and you're making more money selling your merch than you are. So you have to pivot to become a merch, and that's double loop learning. You pivot to become a merch organization, but you find that your name is now completely kind of out of date and doesn't. I'm struggling to think of an example here, but you see it again and again. Companies have names that have no relation to what they actually do.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah, like you have a nice neutral name, but strong, simple, a couple of syllables like Amazon, and Amazon could be anything, couldn't it?
Yeah.
And that's generally true of these companies. Tesla could be anything, that doesn't really say anything in itself necessarily.
Reminds me of when your friend of mine, Steve Rayson, with buddies who'd all worked at Epic as well, started a company called Kineo, and we talked a bit about branding, and I said, well, what's Kineo mean? He says, well, it means nothing really, but the point is it gives you the flexibility to change the company as you need to, and I thought that was pretty clever, really.
I think it meant, I think it was a small Roman boat or something. I
Yeah.
remember speaking to Steve about that.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. But what's interesting about all these, you can bring, I think they all head in one direction, which is thinking deeper about what learning is.
Yeah.
Applying it more rigorously in terms of actual action as opposed to running courses. They weren't really that interested. It was more about knowledge management, dynamic organizations than the world of training. They weren't that interested in that as a topic because they thought it was a bit of a lay-by as opposed to the motorway.
Okay. So I think we're getting somewhere.
Yeah.
Let's go a bit further before we kind of try and draw all these threads together. Yrjö Engeström, 1948, still alive, so I especially don't want to mispronounce his name. Born in Finland, Engeström studied psychology at the University of Helsinki, where he's now Professor Emeritus. A leading figure in cultural historic activity theory, another acronym here, CHAT. He developed the concept of expansive learning, where learning involves transforming the activity systems themselves, not just acquiring knowledge. His work bridges psychology, education, and workplace innovation. Engeström once said his work was about making contradictions productive, a clue to his interest in complex systems and collective problem solving. I hope we're making contradictions productive in this discussion, Donald. So tell us more about his work and what he adds here.
Yeah, so I like this guy because I like that phrase, learning by expanding. But he's a very sort of activity doing orientated theorist. A bit, he's Vygotsky, the big hero. Right. To learn by doing stuff. But I also like the idea that the learning world should focus on contradictions that arise in organizations, real problems, in the work. And what you do through learning is try and resolve those contradictions. That's a really nice idea here because it keeps it focused. As opposed to let's have a course on resilience or whatever topic. It keeps it away from the faddish world of course creation and focuses on solving real problems by doing things in real organizations. So he thinks that learning takes place in the context of these activity systems. Okay, so what is an activity system? For him, it's you as a subject, so you're the learner. Then you've got this object which is the problem space or the contradiction or the task, whatever it is, that you have. You can't get this problem solved, but you have to. And then there are the tools and things you use, the instruments to use it. That could be AI, it could be a word processor, it could be whatever. Okay. You also have other things that he discusses in some detail, the division of labor, and you have rules, regulations, and some cultural things and so on. But so in expansive learning, it's the contradiction between all these different things that cause the problems and give it opportunities. It opens up a window for learning. That's nice. I like that idea. And then he has a very concrete method that's a bit Gagne-ish, and this is where it gets a wee bit more predictable. But I think that's okay because he's trying to be very pragmatic here. And he has these 7 learning actions. Once you've got this contradiction identified, really work hard on saying, what is the real problem here? Not the surface problem. What's the contradiction? Then you've got to really question it, do your analysis, model a new solution. And then there's the usual thing about examining, implementing, reflection, that sort of cycle, getting it solved, and then consolidating the new practice. Okay. So let's try and give our AI an example on that in AI. So you say, right, first of all, you might have the subject as your employees. They're all using AI, bottom up. The object is the problem space. Now, the problem space might be just productivity. My goodness, that company over there is doing it in half the time, and they've just shaved 10% of their pricing. So we have to increase productivity. And your instrument, so subject, object, instrument, which is his distinction is, you're the subject, you're the learner, you've got a productivity problem, and you've got to use AI as opposed to PowerPoint and Excel to solve things, okay? To write those reports, improve your product, improve your marketing, whatever. So you need to question the contradiction, So, and that's where AI is nice because it's a bit of a provocation. It really does do good work there very quickly. If you apply AI to a problem, it will come up with some, even on the ideation level, it will come up with some good things. It will certainly do the analysis for you in terms of data. It will even model up a new solution. It might design and deploy something for you, and then give suggestions on implementation, even reflect or critique on whether, I saw a really interesting thing in a product design the other day where they just fed in the size, shape, weight, and also texture parameters of a product and just asked the AI to improvement. And suddenly the thing came out with something that was almost half the size, much slicker, easier to store, easier to transport. You get the idea? So
Yeah.
I think that's the sort of thinking he's after here. What's the contradiction here? Let's solve it, but let's go to town on solving it. So he's after these broad systemic changes in organizations, not individual learning outcomes. He's not really interested in that. That's what all these learning organization theorists tell us. Don't get bogged down on this individual learning objectives in courses. It's not how organizations work. It's not how the brain works. It's not how learning even works. So I find them useful because they're pragmatic and they have real solutions as opposed to let's just build another course.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think you can extrapolate to education a bit with this, that, it's easy to make the mistake that if you want to learn about a field, this is what you have to learn. These are the concepts that you have to take on board. This is how you do it. And it's that simple. Very often, if it's, if it's something like, fixing a tap, for instance, you want to learn how to do that, you can use that single loop type of thing. But in a subject a bit more complex, like say, in the L&D field, management and leadership comes up all the time, isolating the contradictions and working out how you deal with those is a really important part of it. And so often I think the experience of students going to university, for instance, is they go along thinking, I'm going to go and do a course on English literature or human biology or economics or whatever, and they have a vision of what it's about and the thing that fires them up about the subject. And they get there, and possibly within a term, they realize, God, it's not about that at all. They've given me loads of kind of contradictory opinions here, and I've learned things that seem to completely contradict what I used to believe before I came here. And then if they don't just bounce off that problem, then the rest of their time they will be learning how these kind of contradictions work dynamically together. I think if you're a Hegelian, you would believe that you come up with a synthesis to these things. More often, I think in the real world, you end up realizing that all these things like leadership, management, marketing, whatever, are just riven with contradictions that you somehow have to negotiate your way between extremes and not just kind of take a middle way, perhaps, but live with these contradictions in dynamic opposition. Sorry, am I getting a bit too philosophical, Donald? Here?
No, I think that's spot on. It's a nice way to sort of conclude on this, because I think, Nick Shackleton-Jones goes on about this all the time, and he's right. He's saying, we take the educational model and we apply it in organizations, and it doesn't work. It's all wrong, because most of us actually, after being put through the ringer of intense schooling in college or university, can't wait to see the back of it. We're weary of the endless diet of formal lectures and essays and formal learning and exams. And then I often think it's the woohoo around lifelong learning. You see, when people discuss, it's so often you see, I just refuse to attend any session that's got lifelong learning in its title. They confuse organizational needs, that whole notion, all these things we've been discussing, with concrete pragmatic suggestions, with this sort of really abstract alliterative phrase, lifelong learning. They're not pragmatic at all. And of course, what lifelong learning means, it's in the minds of people. You very often get universities talking about lifelong learning. People don't go back to university later in life. They have nothing to do with lifelong learning. Their model is a sort of 18 to 24-year-old model. It's the 18-year-old undergraduate model. That's what they feed and perpetuate. It's nothing to do with lifelong learning. It's not about schooling people longer and longer. It's a very few return to formal schooling. And I always like Winston Churchill's phrase here, which said, "I'm always ready to learn, although I don't always like being taught." I think that's very true of most adults, And I think what these people are saying is that personal mastery and so on is not about being formally taught. It's about learning how to learn. And adults don't want to be infantilized by this sort of lifelong learning jargon. What are you? I'm a lifelong learner. Really? That sounds incredibly stupid and pompous. They're adults, not learners. And I think the lifelong learning lobby, as it were, who have dismantled vocational learning for all this abstract theoretical schooling stuff, sort of university, let's perpetuate university education forever. They talk the talk, but at the end of the day, their focus is on, schooling. And I think that's a shame, because training often defaults back to that education, schooling, theoretical courses thing, and not solving real problems in organizations. So, life's for living, not learning, life's not a course. And I think these people are supremely pragmatic. And when these are the people who have thought deeply about organizational learning and haven't come up with lifelong learning as a solution or superficial phrases like that, they've come up with practical methods, that heuristics and so on, that help you think through the problem.
So how do we sum this up? What changes in the general thinking about learning in organizations did these theorists bring about?
Yeah, I think for me, they think that learning is, for them, organizational learning. And it's very different. I'm not decrying, going and studying, Assyrian history for as part of your learning. I have no problem in that abstract theoretical stuff on a personal level. But in organizations, I think learning is more fundamentally about change, or with AI. Why learn these things if they're going to be automated? Learn to deal with AI, learn to prompt, co-create, co-critique, collaborate, communicate with AI. I think we have to be thinking that way about, solving the contradiction that we've just discussed. Now, thinking back through these thinkers, it's very interesting. What Argyris and Schön would say is, don't get stuck here. Don't get stuck in some single loop. Oh yeah, I'll just share a couple of prompts and I'll be able to do that email better than I did before. Don't think of it as a single loop problem. Think of it as a double loop problem. And if you think of it as a double loop problem, you will succeed in integrating AI and automating processes and moving the organization forward, because that's your job. And then with Senge, you've got, a big system. He was big on a big systematic push in learning organizations, involving the whole organization, taking learning seriously and systematically around personal mastery. But he didn't talk about courses a lot. And then we have, of course, a big injection of Japanese wisdom that within the people of the organization, you want complete improvement, not only of the individual, but that individual in a communal environment where whatever knowledge or mastery or implicit or tacit knowledge you have, you want to externalize that, share it with everybody so the organization gains, and we all move together, and then eventually turn it back into tacit knowledge again once we've made the improvement. That notion of continuous improvement was a great thing from the Japanese world. And you've been to Japan. It takes you about 10 minutes stepping off, stepping into the center of Tokyo before you feel that communal thing. And then the last theory, of course, with Engelström, whom you pronounced beautifully there, John. I was impressed by that.
Days of practice.
Yes. He's situating learning in a real context, with real activity in the real world, real practice, through solving real contradictions. That surely should be what learning in an organization's about. It's not like doing a course in Latin at school.
Yep.
It's the very opposite. It's about getting things done. That's what your job is, to do things. So I think these theorists point us, all 4 or 5 of them have pointed us in a certain direction. Unfortunately, L&D has pointed us all in another direction, which is this carpet bombing or endless diet of courses, often too abstract and too theoretical. And or something you said was very interesting earlier about education, the assumption that education, there are a set of right answers, and if only you learn to think correctly and get these right answers, job done, you pass the exam. When you go into an organization, this is why organizations are not that big on assessment, because very often there are no right answers on the button. It's a messy, complicated world. That's why I prefer Hellman and Peffer on leadership to the other theorists, because they're saying, actually, leadership barely exists because the world's complicated. There are no essential oils or essential, like little epigrams around compassion and so on that you just learn and become a good leader on the back of. And these people are the same. When you think deeply about a topic, you uncover the complexity, the contradictions that are always there. That's one of the nice things about these people. They sort of accept that that's true, but come up with processes that help you get through it all and improve.
It's clear that the influence of these people has been a lasting one, because, so often during this conversation we brought up how it chimes with their own experience and work life. I've got a question that how might their work help us in approaching some of the challenges that organizational learning currently faces? And it did occur to me, thinking about this yesterday, that one of the things that comes up all the time now in forums is the status of L&D within organizations. Talking to Josh Burson a while ago, who is the same generation as you and I, he says during his time he's seen the status of the CLO decline. And he talked about GE, where they brought in a CLO as a kind of board level strategic role, where it's supposed to help the whole of the organizations kind of appropriately identify the skills it needed and the learning it needed to move forward. But since then, it's kind of gone down and down. It's sort of underneath HR and now underneath global talent and all the rest of it. L&D people constantly feeling they're in the doldrums and how do we get a seat at the top table and so on. Is what you're saying, Donald, what you've been saying, that really L&D deserves to be in that place? That's the right place for it? Or would you also lament the lack of a strategic vision for learning within organizations?
No, I think it's what you just said there. I was just mentally ticking it off, going, that's absolutely right. In fact, it's odd. Yesterday, lunchtime, I was speaking to somebody, a very senior person who had a really senior role in Deloitte's running a whole country. And we were talking about it, and he said, no, I don't think I ever knew the name of the CLO or who they were. It was a complete irrelevance to them. It had no relevance to them whatsoever, And that's somebody, that just sort of struck me, wow, that's amazing. You didn't even know, I barely thought it was relevant to the way he ran his organization. And that's interesting because I think L&D has painted itself into its own corner here. It's like, that sort of cartoon thing where you're painting the white paint and you end up in the corner and you can't step out over the paint. I think we're in that corner now because we haven't taken the business seriously enough. So now we're getting into the old cliche, it
Talking
has
to
be
the
aligned
business.
with the business objectives, but people don't. They just rattle out courses, on whatever stupid faddish ideas come up this year, mindfulness, resilience, whatever it is, So it's been true for some time, that decline. Now I think AI is shaking this up massively, fundamentally, because people are doing it for themselves separately from L&D. None of this AI stuff that people are using to either complete tasks or find things out, the sort of performance support for AI, the 1 billion use, it broke the 1 billion use ChatGPT in February. What are they doing, that 1 billion uses? They're solving problems. They're doing what we've just discussed. They're trying to resolve contradictions that are coming across as they're doing the job in the workflow. But they're not going anywhere near L&D, and L&D are not going anywhere near AI. They're trying to formalize, let's run a course on AI. Let's write a terrible policy that immobilizes people and frightens them to death. Let's write a framework. I was speaking to somebody in Barcelona, this massive grant for, she'd been involved with it for 2 years, writing a framework on AI. And she's a very practical person, the rest of her academics. She said, no sooner have we written something than it's out of date.
Yeah.
She said, we're treating AI as schooling. You have to have a course on AI literacy. No sooner have we written the course than it sounds stupid and old-fashioned because it hasn't taken into consideration the huge leap forward that the technology has taken. So I think if we don't, AI is not only a provocation, it's a sort of, it's like these, the next door neighbour's got bamboo and suddenly the shoots come up on your lawn, starts spiking through your world. And it's spreading absolutely like wildfire now, and there's no stopping it. The empirical numbers are really clear. Massive global use in organizations, in universities, in schools, wherever you go. Everybody's using the damn thing. But here's the rub. Organizations are not taking it seriously. They're pulling up the drawbridge, trying to fend it off, stop it, or writing sort of stuck in writing policies and frameworks as opposed to taking action. All the people we've discussed would have very enlightened views on how to deal with this, but people in L&D don't know that much of this. They don't know how. They don't have the tools to cope with this, so they're being overtaken on the motorway. To use, sorry, I've got loads of mixed metaphors here, from bamboo to motorways. The danger is that not only have we painted ourselves, and we're sort of parked up on a lay-by where we've almost got like one of those burger vans dishing out courses while everybody's speeding by, Well, that was a horrible analogy to end on, wasn't it?
Yeah. And it's rather a gloomy picture. There must be oases of good practice in there amidst what you see as a generally bad picture. But I think we've certainly brought up some concepts and ideas and people here that are helpful for people. Double loop learning especially is something. Agile, of course, is something, a methodology to kind of remember, because we're going to need to do a lot of pivoting in the world coming up, I think. And hopefully the discussion today is going to have helped some people in sources they can look at for what to learn and how to do that. So thanks a lot, Donald, for another very interesting
group of thinkers, really, weren't they? They're a very interesting little bunch of people.
Yeah.
Great Minds on Learning comes from the Learning Hack team and is produced by John Helmer. The podcast is based on a series of blog posts written by Donald Clark, and we thank Donald for his kind collaboration in this project. We'd also like to extend a heartfelt thanks to our sponsors for this season.